The crisis in Iraq heightening as ISIS militants advance towards the capital city of Baghdad, taking over 4 western Iraqi towns. Well, tonight we're speaking with 2 U.S. soldiers who served in Iraq. We will hear where they stand on this and whether they believe the U.S. is taking the right course of action now. And Secretary of State John Kerry, he undergoes his most challenging mission yet, an unannounced visit to Baghdad. The Secretary turning up the pressure on Iraqi leaders, telling them they got to boost efforts to quell the sectarian violence and open up their government. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki promises the U.S. a new government. The question is, will this help change the violent situation on the ground? Plus, we will head to the Garden State, where Governor Christie is taking yet another blow over sports betting. The U.S. Supreme Court allowing a ban on betting to remain in place. Well, tonight, RFL speaking with Senator Ray Lesniak is introducing a bill that would make it legal anyway. Does this legislation have a shot? Good evening and welcome to RFL, everybody. I am Richard French, and thank you so much for joining us. This evening, we begin overseas in Iraq, where militants are continuing their aggressive and violent push towards the capital city of Baghdad. The Sunni militants, they took control of the border crossing between Iraq and Jordan. That was late Sunday night, and in efforts captured 4 additional towns. Authorities, they're concerned that ISIS may advance all the way to the city of Haditha and take control of key water supplies and damage the power grid in the process. Today, Secretary of State John Kerry, he made an unannounced visit to Baghdad, where he met with Iraqi leaders, including the Prime Minister. Secretary Kerry urging them to begin forming a new government by July 1st is the deadline that would give more power to political opponents.
The very future of Iraq depends on choices that will be made in the next days and weeks. And the future of Iraq depends primarily on the ability of Iraq's leaders to come together.
We need to do our work here as Iraqis, but this is a most welcome gesture of support from the United States.
Al-Maliki is calling on the U.S. to launch air assaults here. However, the White House has said the U.S. will not carry out airstrikes as of yet. Thursday, President Obama announced the U.S. will deploy 300 military advisors to Iraq and increase surveillance and intelligence. However, the President said the U.S. will not carry out combat operations. Well, get a sense of where the public stands on this. A CBS News poll came out today showing that 50% of Americans believe the U.S. does not have a responsibility to stabilize the violence in Iraq, while 42% say it is America's responsibility to intervene. 41% of respondents pleased with the way the president's handled the crisis, and a little under 30% say the president should do more, with 22% saying he should do even less than he is. All right, let's bring in our guest tonight. We've talked to military experts, strategists, elected officials, but what we wanted to do tonight was to get as much as we can of the ground truth. And many of you may have seen in the Journal News recently a piece that focuses just on some of those men. We are joined by Chris Day, former Army lieutenant stationed near Mosul during Operation Iraqi Freedom back in 2008. Chris also is running for Congress in Westchester County against Congresswoman Nita Lowey. And Christopher Arnold also joins us. He is a decorated Iraq War combat veteran and a former journalist himself. Chris served in Tikrit in 2004 and 2005, also the Director of Public Affairs for the Yonkers City Council, and he served as top staffer of the New York State Assembly for 6 years and wrote and passed the historic Veterans Employment Protection Bill. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We'll get into the politics part of this to a degree next segment. What I'd love to do is, we see spots on a map. We see graphic images of some of the fighting here. We see acronyms or logos for groups. But for us, it's hard, for most of us, it's hard for us to put our arms around it. If you both, and I'll start with you, Christopher, if you can give a little bit more of a description about not just where you were and what you did, but what you saw when you were there.
Well, I'd be happy to. And I was stationed in Tikrit in 2004 and 2005, as you referenced, with the Civil Affairs Battalion out of Danbury, Connecticut. Our unit's call sign was Phoenix, and our unit's motto was Purge Modo Restidimus, which literally means, from the ashes we restore. It's taken after the motto of the city of Danbury, where our unit is from. And the city earned that motto in 1777 after the British had burned the city of Danbury and the citizens rebuilt it from the ground up. And that's the basic function of our unit. We would build roads, schools, hospitals, distribute humanitarian aid, And most importantly, we coordinated the first Iraqi elections and Iraqi referendum.
So talk about when you got there, what it looked like and what you guys did to restore it and what you understand it looks like now.
Well, when I got there, we were actually stationed at the presidential palace compound where Saddam Hussein had lived. So it was quite opulent, and the city of Tikrit was relatively safe compared to the entire AO, which was, or that's area of operations, which was 4 provinces. But the most important functions of civil government were in complete disarray. So the country, which had never been a democracy, was now without a government. And we started out with the Coalition Provisional Authority and then the transitional government. And it was really my unit's role to take it from that transitional government to the government we see today to some extent, through the Iraqis having that first referendum to decide, yes, we want to be a parliamentary democracy. So we had a regional reconstruction operations center which focused on public works, electricity, completed over 1,300 projects that cost $1.8 billion. When we got there, there had never been more than 8 hours a day of power in the city that was Saddam's hometown, and the people there believed that that was the most that they could ever have, and they said, you Americans, you'll never get the power on 24 hours a day, but we did. We also had a civil military coordination center where we focused on public health, education, building hospitals and schools, and certainly the insurgency had a very sophisticated PR apparatus in that we would complete a project and say, courtesy of the coalition forces, and we would drive by the next day and there might be a sign up that says, courtesy of this local sheikh. So that was something that we had to contend with. But what we're seeing today had its genesis sort of at the tail end of when I was there, which was the, at the time I believe it was called Ansar al-Sunnah, who was led by Zarqawi, whose goal was to create a sectarian religious war between Sunni and Shiites.
If I could, when you left, you got on a plane to come home, right? Did you think they got a fighting shot here? They're going to make it now? Or were you worried at that point that 10 years later, 9 years later, that we sit here now, that we see the disaster unfolding here, where literally they're moving on the capital city?
Well, I don't know that I'm really qualified to answer that question, in that I'd probably be more at home discussing the gubernatorial race than the geopolitics of Iraq. What I can say is that when I left, we were very hopeful, and it was like a phoenix rising from the ashes. And I stayed up on it, and I saw in 2006 that Zarqawi's group became more and more successful, but by engaging all of the various sects in that country. And it is a country that is as diverse as this one. You have Persians, you have Arabs, you have Turkmen, you have Kurds, you have Sunnis, you have Shiites, you have Sufis, you have al-Takridis, you have al-Baghdadis, and you have this gigantic pot of people that had been drawn into an artificial boundary by the British. To get them to work together and to elect their own representatives made me hopeful, and I was quite surprised and disappointed to see what's taken place now.
Chris, talk about when you got in country and the experiences you saw before you left.
Sure. Well, I spent only a couple months in Iraq. After that, I did a year in Afghanistan. And I tell you, comparing the two places, the area of Iraq I was stationed is Tal Afar, which is on the map that was just up just next to Mosul. It was totally pacified by the time I was there. We were at the point where we were dealing with smugglers and that sort of thing. It wasn't massive amounts of terrorist attacks. The sectarian violence had totally cooled off, and this was post-surge Iraq. So, it was kind of a shock, to see this going on TV, in the sense that, I knew what the place was like, and to remember going through that area and then see footage of insurgents once again going through it when they hadn't been doing that when we were there. It's a bit disturbing. There was a photo that went up of me with a bunch of kids. Those kids live right where this insurgency is occurring. And the thing is with this group, it's not just a sectarian conflict type group. They're there to put extremist ideology into place. One of the reasons they've had room to do that is because the government of Iraq hasn't been able to forcefully continue to control the area the way it was immediately post the surge, when we still had combat troops there. They haven't been able to step in and fill that vacuum, and these groups have found some favor amongst the Sunni locals. And the area is bordering the Kurdish region, which is controlled largely by the Kurdish forces, the Peshmerga. And they've been very good, but it's hard to stand up against such a rampaging, violent group when they're threatening your people like that.
Did you think when you guys were there, and I know you've had buddies that have stayed behind, that was there the sense that when we handed the keys over to the Iraqis and the Iraqi military that we spent, God knows, not only in terms of blood, as you guys know better than I, but also treasure in terms of training and army, etc., that they'd stand up and recognize Iraq not in sectarian terms, but that they were part of a coherent Iraqi military? Or are you guys unsurprised that we've seen pictures of them dropping their guns and literally stripping off their uniforms and melding in with the general population running from these guys?
But, it's not surprising that they've continued to view themselves in a sectarian way. I mean, their identity is so tied up in it. They're Iraqis second after Kurds, after Sunni, after Shia, after all the different tribal affiliations too. You have to remember there are tribal affiliations. You have to go through tribal elders to do things. The thing that's not that surprising is the way we withdrew, because they weren't quite ready, I don't think, to take control on their own. The forces weren't there. We didn't have a long tail of support that they would have needed. They were at the point where they were much more competent in conducting operations. They're at the point where they could hold territory, not in the face of an overwhelming power like a coordinated insurgency, but just maintain the peace stably. But without a continued follow-up in terms of logistics and training post our withdrawal of combat troops, it was at that point I kind of got the sense that it was a matter of time before we started to see sectarian things flare up. The question was how violent it was going to be and how dangerous it would be. And it seems we got the most extreme version of sectarian conflict that could have resulted. It could have just peacefully gotten more autonomy. It could any sort of thing. This is probably the worst case.
And again, this group ISIS was such a violent sect of Al-Qaeda that even Al-Qaeda disassociated themselves from these guys. So, all right, we're going to take a quick commercial break. But when we come back, we'll get into a hard question that you've seen the poll numbers. The American public doesn't have an appetite for this, but this is beyond Iraq. This has regional concerns here where borders of so many different countries have unique and some common real concerns about how this could spiral out of control. We're going to talk about what we do about it, and if we look back and the sacrifices of so many, if it was worth it. We'll be right back after this.